Hey folks, today I thought I'd show you how I go about soldering fine pitch surface mount components. I usually do this by hand. I don't have a pick and place or anything. Today we're working with 0603 components, but the same rules apply to smaller ones, and I figured I'd show how I do this with a little bit of paste or with just a standard iron and some solder. So, for example, I've got C9 here, this pad here on the board, and then I've also got the capacitor I'm going to be placing here. It's a little 0603, and then obviously you're going to want a decent set of smaller tweezers as well. Having a decent set of tweezers is going to be fairly critical to being able to manipulate these sorts of a component. So there's that. I suppose I forgot to mention, with the solder paste, I will be using a bit of hot air instead of the soldering iron. So we'll go through one of each, and then hopefully I'll be able to keep the board in frame here on this this microscope. It's a 15x, and so it's a little tighter than I would normally work at with maybe a 7 or 10x. So unfortunately, that's the limitation of the camera I have. So to start with, I'm going to see about placing some of this solder paste. You can see the needle here. It's not terribly in focus, but needle with a little bit of paste sticking out the front there on this this syringe I have here of solder paste. It doesn't terribly matter, but this is Kester EP256 leaded solder paste, but it should work with just about anything you have. So, let's see if I can line myself up here. And usually, it's hard for me to get a decent reference for where things are at if I'm doing this through the microscope, but I'll just look here by hand and get it in close and give it a little bit of squeeze, get a little bit out, and just kind of drag it till it falls off. That one's not coming off, but there's a little mound there, and there's a little extra on the end of the needle that I think I can get to come off on that other pad there. So now we've got a little bit of paste on both pads. It should make that pretty easy. So now I'm going to take my tweezers off screen here and grab that capacitor we were looking at a moment ago, and I'm going to bring that here in frame and kind of drop that on top of the solder paste, and it's going to sit there. I might actually squish that down just a little bit, just kind of push it into the paste. And so then there's that. So that's pretty much ready for soldering. If I get my hands out of the way here. And I apologize, I don't know if you guys are going to be able to hear this on the video, but I'll turn on my hot air gun and see if we can get that melted down. You can see it's heating up. The paste has flown more. You can see the liquid flux kind of around it. And hopefully before long you'll see it start to liquefy, and then it'll wick up onto the pads and onto the capacitor itself. There we go. It's starting to liquefy a little bit. There we go. One of the nice things about working with paste is that as it flows, it's going to automatically place that component for you. The component's kind of going to float due to surface tension with the solder there. So as it heats up and gets steady, then it's going to flow and sit perfectly on the pad exactly where you want it. And so that capacitor is done. That's all there is to it in that regard. Turn my heat gun off there, and it's going to take a minute while it's running there to cool down. But let me see if I can position the board here for another component, the same value. I've got to do a few of these. So I'm going to aim at that one and maybe get it in view. That C4? Yes, it is. So there's that one there. Oh, that looks pretty good. So this time I'm going to do the same job, but I'm going to use a soldering iron and some solder. As before, I usually use leaded solder. The key with this here is going to be using pretty much as fine of solders you can find. This is a 0.015 inch diameter solder. It's got a flux core. Let me see if I can get that maybe into frame a little bit. So it's pretty thin, especially when you compare it to the 0603 pads there on the board. And then the other part of that is that having a good iron. This is I use a Heiko 936, which is, in my opinion, very reasonably priced, and for hobbyists, you can't, I don't know as if you can get much better. The 936 these days has been discontinued, but its replacement, the FX888, and then now the FX888D, is again very, very well priced, very easily attainable by most any hobbyist, and really changing my soldering iron from the soldering sticks that you get at Radio Shack, now gone unfortunately, or a fat Weller that's been around for 100 years. Made a huge difference in my capability, my ability to actually put parts on boards without destroying things. So I cannot recommend a good iron enough. Along those lines, a good tip is going to be really important. That's another thing, is that I use my Heiko iron, and I use the Heiko branded tips because they're going to be very high quality. There are a lot of Heiko knockoff stations, and in theory, if you can fit the Heiko tips on them, I would recommend it. Some of these Heiko knockoff stations are going to be, like, you might be able to get the whole thing for $20, $30, and for that price, you're going to get 2 or 3 actual Heiko brand tips, but they're going to be worth it. They're going to last a long time. They're going to wet well. They're going to conduct heat well. The tips really are a significant part of the soldering station setup. So I usually just keep 1 or 2 extras on hand in case I need to replace one, but one will last me for quite some time. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this whole thing in frame. Maybe. You can kind of see. So I have a bent conical tip. At the tip there, it gets pretty fine, and then it bends into a much fatter section. I like this one because the fatter section keeps the thermal mass out there, makes it easy to heat things, but I can also use the tip for very fine work. So I'm going to use my my fine solder here and my fine tip, and I'm just going to wet one of these pads. There we go. So we've got one of those pads with some solder on it, and one of them without. And that's my technique for placing components with soldering iron. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to place the capacitor on the board nearby so I can reposition my hand. So I've got my tweezers in my left hand, and I'm right-handed, and I will use my soldering iron in the right hand. And so I'm going to hopefully keep this out of the shadow, and I'm going to come down. I'm going to grab my component there. So I've got it here, trying not to hold on to this bottom end, because that's where I'm going to be soldering. So I'm going to kind of place it on this upper pad in your view. I'm actually touching it against the board, and I'm going to melt this bottom pad of solder and just kind of slide it into place. And it's going to wick onto this component. And then that component is set. So then I can let go, or I can even grab it. I could try to wiggle it a little bit. It's not going to go anywhere. So that's soldered on. Once that's done, I can come back with my fine solder, kind of take a different angle with my tip here, and I can grab the other side. And so now that's soldered on both sides. Maybe I'll come back and touch this one up now that both sides are set. And so that's soldered. So that would be my 2 techniques for either using solder paste or a wire solder, and then associated with each of those is going to be either using a a heat gun or a rework soldering station, or in the case of wire solder, you're going to have a standard soldering iron, soldering pencil, whatever you want to call it. So for reference, my soldering iron I usually set it to about 350. A mistake a lot of people make, 350 Celsius, that is, mistake a lot of people make that I see, is that they turn it way up because they've gotten used to that with cheap or crappy irons or pencils or stations, and they have to turn it way up to get it to work, and you end up burning through your tips really fast. 350 seems to be a pretty good number for me. It's about mid-range on my dial, and it seems to work pretty well. The tips last a long time, and the whole thing just isn't burning up. My hot air gun, usually, I set that at something like 325 to 350 degrees Celsius, and it works pretty good as well. So anyway, so that was placement of a part using solder paste, and placement of a part using some soldering wire. I haven't ever used any stencils. Most of my stuff I'm doing in small enough quantities that stencils don't make a whole ton of sense, and I'm capable. I'm fortunate enough that I have steady enough hands and good enough eyesight that I can do this. But if you don't, then some head-mounted magnifying glasses, or a overhead microscope like you're viewing on the camera here can help you a lot there. So anyway, if you have any questions, then please let me know.